So welcome everyone to Spring Stories. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am located on unceded Indigenous lands. Jojage, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. We acknowledge them and other nations who care for the land across our country, recorded and unrecorded. We pay our respects to Canada's first storytellers. So for those of you who have been following my activities, you may have concluded correctly that I have had very little time to do creative writing. However, I am very happy that this spring, particularly towards the end of, all of the month of March, let's say, I have been working on the text that I will be reading. It's a nonfiction piece. It has allowed me to revisit my stories and make the connection between Italy, my personal history, my family history, and the Italy in my stories. So it's been really an interesting project, and I have Angelo Bolotta to thank for that. So this is my narrative, which will appear in his edited volume, but which right now appears online. I will give you the link afterwards, so you'll be able to see the pictures. And the title is Italy Through Words and Images. So, I am a Montrealer, and my roots are Venetian. I have spent 54 out of 58 years of my life in Canada, with many return trips to Italy. Whether it is the one I left behind at the age of 4 or the one I now visit as a writer, Italy continues to be important in my daily life in Montreal. When I was pregnant with my first child, my husband, who was born in Montreal of Calabrian parents, my husband and I made the decision to speak Italian to our children, even though Dominic and I had always spoken English to each other, the language we learned in primary school. And I'm grateful for the decision that we made to teach our children Italian. Today, our adult children all speak Italian, o bene o male. They speak Italian to their grandparents, but we speak English at dinner time when just the 5 of us are together. On a recent trip with my youngest child, who is now 19, and by recent, I mean 2019, pre-COVID, then in 2019, June of 2019, I realized that my children would certainly benefit from extended stays in Italy to improve their language skills. After just 1 week in Rome, my son was more comfortable and certainly more confident speaking Italian than when he arrived. The grandparents played a crucial role in my children's connection to Italy and to the Italian language, just as my own grandparents did for me from a distance. Unlike most of my classmates and friends, I grew up in Montreal North without grandparents. As soon as I began to read and write in elementary school, my mother encouraged me to send letters and cards to my grandparents in Italy. I had no formal schooling in Italian, unfortunately. While my neighborhood friends went to Italian school on Saturday mornings, I worked in my parents' butcher shop. I could learn Italian by reading, my father used to say. No need for Italian classes. There is a photo of my paternal grandfather, Nonno Guido Canton, on one knee on the sese, which translates as the threshing floor. He's in front of his farmhouse. He has his arms around his granddaughters, my sister Esther and me, the only 2 grandkids he had at the time. One is tiny and smiling, unaware of this goodbye moment. The other is looking down, her face hidden by her hair, hand on her lips. She is wearing a celeste dress made by a seamstress in town specifically for this day in June of 1967. Just after that photo was taken, we were driven to Milan's Malpensa airport, where our teary eyed maternal grandfather, Nonno Gino Busato, said goodbye to us. He was a crier, like me. On that day, and every other time we saw each other afterwards, there were always lots of tears. Tears of joy every time we returned to Italy, tears of sorrow every time we departed. Tears of Italy, I called them. For as much as I associate Italy with fun in the sun, it is also the source of much sadness and loss. Where were the grandmothers? I have always wondered. There is no photo of Nonna Gemma, who was married to Nonno Guido. What was she doing while the goodbye photo was taken? Was she too shy or not well dressed enough to step into the photo? Did the photographer not ask her to be in the photo? Was she in the house, too sad to come out? I have considered the possibility that there is a photo with Nonna Gemma and her granddaughters, Licia and Esther, that just didn't make it into my parents' album. I don't know. And where is Edda, my mother? She must be standing not too far away from her daughters. But this is the Canton side of the family. That's why Edda, my mother, is not in the photo. This photo was taken for my father, Achille, to remember the last moment that his father, Guido, had with his daughters. My father had not seen his family for nearly a year while he was in Montreal, earning enough money to prepare a small apartment for us. Nonno Gino's wife, Nonna Gina, yes, he was Gino, she was Gina, and the other grandparents, one was Guido and one was Gemma. So all G's. Nonno Gino's wife, Nonna Gina, tutta peperina, as I remember her, was always front and center. Why was she not in the car with us going to Milan? There's a photo of our departure from the Milan airport that day in June of 1967. My mother and her daughters are being escorted to the plane by the airline agent. My baby sister is in my mother's arms and is not visible as we are walking away from the photographer. My mother left behind her parents and siblings to join her husband in Montreal. I can only imagine their sadness that morning as we set off for a distant land. No one else in the Busato clan had emigrated to Canada. My mother's father, Gino, cried as he watched us leave. He didn't think he'd ever see his daughter again. Years later, my grandmother, Gina, told me that she had tried to convince him not to go to the airport. She knew that he would be inconsolable after seeing us leave. While he watched us walk towards the plane, she had already chosen her plumpest faraona, plucked its white spotted plumage, and prepared brodo, which cured all ailments. The faraona is part of our family heritage for culinary and medicinal reasons. It cures heartbreak and sadness. Both my grandmothers raised chickens and guinea hens, but the latter were reserved for special occasions. Even today, when I tell my father that I made chicken for dinner, he'll retort, chicken, bah, faraona is the best. For my parents, the faraona is a staple. They don't buy chicken. Maybe it is because the faraona reminds them of home and specifically special occasions and happy times. Or maybe it is because they can now afford it. I never buy faraona because it's more expensive than a chicken. I would need to buy two or three to prepare a meal for the five of us. Besides, I always eat faraona at my parents' house, or at least I did before COVID. And I want to let everybody know that for Easter, my gift was two faraone, uncooked, of course. Nonno Gino cried when his daughter left and every time they spoke on the phone. But it wasn't my mother's choice to come to Canada 54 years ago. And this is a quote from one of my stories, Watching Them Laugh, which appears in The Pink House and Other Stories. My mother left a sunny, rural setting to follow a man with extravagant ideas. She followed him to a cold, distant land without asking any questions, even though she wasn't always happy. She would have preferred to live closer to her parents and siblings. She would have preferred not leaving a warm environment to settle in a small basement apartment in a glacial city where she didn't have any friends, where she did not speak the language. For many years, she worked in the cold and wore steel toe boots, steel mesh gloves under cotton ones, and a woolen winter sweater under her white butcher coat. She spent her days in the cold, even in the summertime. She worked with young men who were stronger but less efficient and less courageous than her. She was always in the cold. Perhaps she would have preferred hoeing the land under the Venetian sun. After decades in the cold, she could have been bitter or disappointed about life, but she isn't. No, she is always smiling, still positive, always youthful. Even today, at 85, she looks younger than her age. It was my choice, however, to return to Italy in my early 20s. In fact, my parents did their utmost to dissuade me. Of course, I had spent my childhood and adolescence pining for the Italy that I had left behind at age 4. I thought of Italy as warm and cuddly, like the affectionate hugs I received from relatives every time I returned. I equated Italy to days at the beach in Sottomarina and the Sagre, and bumping into family members and distant relatives at the Mercato on Friday mornings. I returned 3 times with my mother and sister in the 1970s. Later on, as university students, my sister and I spent 3 of our 4-month break working in our parents' business and one, the month of August, in Italy on vacation. That was the deal. By the mid 1980s, I had fallen for a young man who lived in Rome. And in 1987, I decided to make my life there. In the end, that brief period spent in Italy proved to be very painful. I wrote a prize winning story titled From the Sixth Floor about that devastating experience, which appears in the book Almond, Wine, and Fertility. I also refer to it in the story Refuge in the Vineyard. I was rejected and dejected. I was in pain. I was broken. And here's a quote from Refuge in the Vineyard, which appears in The Pink House and Other Stories. Many years ago, they, the vines, had listened. They had consoled her, the rejected lover, when he whose name shall not be said ever, ever again, he who had broken her heart into tiny little pieces, then stomped on the pulsating bits and laughed. He had. He had laughed at the thought that she would never be able to make it whole again. That was pain, dolore. But I have no regrets. All that transpired before led me to where I am today. I got myself out of there physically and eventually emotionally. The latter took quite some time. I took my anger out on Italy. Back in Montreal, I was bitter. I remember, so bitter. I stopped listening to local Italian radio. I stopped listening to Italian music and pop songs. The late 1980s and early 1990s are a blur. I have no recollection of political or cultural events in Italy from that period. If one of my relatives got married, had a baby, or was ill during that period, I cannot recall. I just focused on my career and my social life, and I did not go back to Italy for 10 years. Eventually, I reconnected with Italy through literature. First, by reading the works of Italian Canadian writers and writing about them. Then, by writing my own stories. I was teaching composition and literature to adult learners when I decided that I too should go back to school. William Kinsley, one of my professors at Université de Montréal, first mentioned the Association of Italian Canadian Writers, the AICW. He assumed that because of my Italian roots, I'd be interested in working on authors with Italian roots. My PhD thesis, titled The Question of Identity in Italian Canadian Fiction, focused on the writings of Nino Ricci, Frank Paci, Mary Melfi, Caterina Edwards, and Antonio D'Alfonso. The thesis analyzed the representation of the hyphenated identity in 7 novels. It argued that the Italian and the Canadian identities are illustrated in the very organization of the different narrative strands and in the weaving of the words on the page. The first story that I wrote and published, From the Sixth Floor, won an award in 2001 from the Canadian Authors Association, as did the Italian self-translation titled Dal Sesto Piano in 2004. That encouraged me to keep writing. I would say that this story caused an important transition in my writing, from academic essays to short stories. It may not come as a complete surprise to anyone who has followed my writing that From the Sixth Floor is not entirely fiction. And although Refuge in the Vineyard is fiction, the main character has an ambivalent connection with Italy after an abusive relationship and a painful breakup. I had vowed never, never to return to Rome. But Rome is also the place where I gained the strength to say what it is that I do not want and to act on it. And this is a quote from the Sixth Floor. I didn't wait for him to get back. I quickly dried myself and packed an overnight bag. That last scene was just what I needed to give me the strength to leave. Forget the priests. No one deserves to be treated that way. I just couldn't jump. It would have served no purpose. The Italian Canadian literary community brought me back to Italy figuratively and literally. First, as a recent PhD graduate attending the Canadian Studies Conference in Bologna in 1999. Then, as an active member of the AICW, for which I have been volunteering since 1996. In June of 2010, my husband and I landed in Rome the day before heading to the town of Atri in Abruzzo for the conference of the Association of Italian Canadian Writers. I had agreed to arrive in Rome, sleep one night at Fiumicino, the town, and drive to Atri the next day. What? You're not going to Rome? My firstborn was incredulous when we called to say that we had landed. Come on, you're right there. Hearing it from my child, I realized how silly I was being. A vow made when I was broken was no longer binding or valid. We had lunch and took a romantic stroll in Rome the next day. And for the past 10 years, I have been going to Rome regularly, and I've reconnected with one of my friends there, Annalisa. I have also read my writing at La Sapienza and at l'Università Roma III. I took each of my children to Rome when they turned 18. Hopefully, and unlike me, they will only have happy memories of Rome. Rome is no longer about pain and loss. It is about growth and wonderment. So that is Italy through words and images. It was really an interesting experience to revisit, as I said, my personal history and also my writing history. And it was also interesting to go through pictures and to give my parents, who have nothing to do now that they're obliged to stay home, to go through old pictures, albums, to find just the right pictures to illustrate this narrative. And this narrative appears on the site Transformations Canada. And I know that some of you who are here today have contributed to this very worthy project. And Angelo Ballotta has been working on it for a number of years. I believe he started in 2011. And I see Liana has put the link in the chat. So anyone who's interested to read my narrative or to look at the pictures. There's some interesting pictures there. Picture of me and Decio in June of 2019 in front of Villa Farnesina in Rome. And we often talk about, now that we're not able to travel, and Decio and I are big travelers, we often talk about that last trip to Rome. And then there's a picture of Nono Guido with little Licia, 4-year-old, and little Esther, who's about, I think she's about 16 months or 18 months. Beautiful picture, one of my favorite pictures. And then there's another little Licia photo that was taken in March 1967 when I was 4. And it actually says on the photo that the date is still there. One of the things that my parents complained about as they were sifting through photos, especially the photos post children, that is post grandchildren, somewhere along the line we stopped putting the date behind the photo, and that was very frustrating to them. So I had to do some research to figure out what year, check in with my sister based on the sweaters we were wearing. What year did we wear that sweater? So that was an interesting conversation. And all of these texts I sent my sister Esther. Do you know, was that 1980 or was that 1979? And she'd ask, what do you want to know for? There's an interesting photo here that I really like, the Busato clan. And that is taken right after the day of my parents' wedding. You remember back when people changed out of their out of the bridal gown and the bridal suit, and then took dressed, I guess, ready to go off on their honeymoon. And this is a photo, black and white photo of the Cusmano clan. And Nonna Gina is not in that photo. And I realized after having, given all the photos to Angelo to illustrate this piece, that I don't have any photos to give him with Nonna Gina and Nonna Gemma. There was one photo with Nonna Gina that we found at a wedding that Esther and I went to in 1992. And it wasn't good enough for this to illustrate this piece. There's a photo of my parents and my sister and I celebrating our first Christmas in Montreal on the Récollet Street. We lived in the basement apartment, but of course the photo was taken in the landlord's apartment next to the Christmas tree because, that was a nicer home. The person upstairs had the bigger apartment. And so probably a photo that was sent off to relatives to show that we were okay. We didn't have that nice furniture, as I remember. Then there's an interesting photo that Angelo really insisted on of my mother working in a refrigerated storage of my parents' meat packing in 1980. And then finally, the people who follow me on Facebook will recognize this photo. It's a photo of me and little Decio in a vineyard taken in Cavarzere in 2009. And that's the photo that inspired the fictional story Refuge in the Vineyard. Oh, there's more photos. There's a photo of the 5 of us, Dominic and I, with Dario, Decio, and Liana, on our 25th wedding anniversary. That would have been in June of 2018. And there's a picture of Liana and I in front of St. Peter's when we went to Italy in May of 2013. And that photo was taken by Rosetta Rosati, who's here today. Thanks for being here, Rosetta. And finally, there's a photo of my father, my mother, Esther, and I at the Mirabel Airport in November of 2018 when Esther took my mother to Italy to celebrate her 83rd birthday with her siblings. Because one of the things my mother always complained about was that whereas her siblings celebrated their birthdays together, she never had the opportunity to do that. So when she turned 80, I took her to Italy in 2015. And when she turned 83, Esther took my mom to Italy to celebrate with her remaining siblings because some of them have passed away. So that is it for my reading. The only other thing I want to mention is part of the reason that I don't have that much time for writing is because I'm really focusing on a very important project that is the Queer Italian Canadian Project. A lot of you have heard about it or have been bombarded by messages and requests for support. So we've put out a documentary called Creative Spaces, Queer and Italian Canadian, where I interview three writers of Italian heritage. And because of COVID, I wasn't able to continue filming across Canada, and I hope to continue that in 2022, I guess, 22, 23. And so, out of the fact that I wasn't able to continue the film, was born an anthology, which will be launched on June 22nd. And it's called Here and Now, an anthology of queer Italian Canadian writing. And it has 35 contributors. So that is it for me. And I've taken longer than I thought I would. It's already 12:31. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them about what I read or about any of my projects. So Liana, do you want to let me know if there are any questions?
Yes, we have a couple questions in the chat. The first one is from Carmelinda Shian, who asks, Licia, do you feel that, in spite of the sadness and the forlornness, that your life's experience has been made richer by your sharing the two cultures, Italian and Canadian?
Yes, of course. Yes, yes. It was tough growing up because unlike, like I said, a lot of the people that I knew growing up who celebrated, the holidays, Christmas, Easter with family all the time. I mean, we had friends. My parents had friends, but whenever it came to a celebration, Christmas, Easter, birthdays, we were alone because the other families had big families. So and I found that was sad. So New Year's Eve, for instance, then we hung out with friends. But Christmas, I remember calling. My parents would call their parents in Italy, and I always tried to hide so that I wouldn't have to say anything on the phone because I knew that I would, start crying. Like I said, I was a crier. I'm still a crier, but just I cry a little bit less. I cry in the shower now. But yes, definitely, I think my life is richer because I grew up here and I went to school here. And now, for personal or professional reasons, I have opportunities, or at least had pre-COVID, to go back to Italy. And I'm grateful for that.
Eloise Carbone asks, does your sister have the same connection with Italy as you do?
Very good question, Eloise. I would say no. I think my sister is here today.
He is
Uh,
on the
I'm sorry?
he is on the call.
Okay. So I would say that I have well, I mean, my sister has her own connection with Italy, but she was much tinier. I mean, I remember leaving my grandparents. Esther, just came to Canada. It was like fun for her, but certainly she has a connection with all the relatives because of the summers we spent there, because we didn't have any relatives here when my parents were able to, and they waited quite a bit to send us back. But it was very important for my parents for us to get to know our grandparents and our aunts and uncles. But I would say, and I think Esther would agree, that I'm closer to my aunts and uncles and cousins, especially. Maybe because I go more often now, or I've made a big effort to stay in touch with everyone. Yeah. Oh, I think Chenti is asking if we can hear from Esther. Esther, do you want to weigh in on that? Do you have an opinion, or do you want to share? You don't have to. I mean, but Well, Esther might be there, but maybe she's in the kitchen preparing lunch. We might see her on the screen, but she's in the kitchen. That happens sometimes. People turn on computers to support an event and then they take off and do something else.
Buongiorno a tutti. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, Esther, we can hear.
Hi. Hi. So happy to join you and to participate in this great what do you call it? Spring story. I have a connection, definitely a very strong connection. However, my life took on a little bit of a different course, and I have stories to tell. I'm just not ready to tell them because I have to write them, and I think I'm going to start writing them when I retire because I have my hands full right now. But I am definitely taking notes, and I will be very happy to share those stories with everybody.
Esther, do you think that you have a stronger connection than I do to Italy, or do you think I have a stronger connection to Italy than you do?
I think it's different. I don't know if it's stronger or weaker, but it is certainly different.
Yeah, that's true. Different, not stronger or weak.
No, I mean, I did spend a lot of time speaking to my Zia Luisa on Easter Day, which was also her birthday. And whenever I call, it just brings me back to the past. And I'm very happy that we're able to still have this connection, and also on the WhatsApp with our cousins.
Yep.
But I haven't gone back as often as you, Licia.
Yeah.
And but definitely there are very strong connections. And I also want to go and see the church where I was baptized.
Yeah.
So I do really, and I would love to go back with both you, Licia, and mother and father to start off the journey like full circle. I think that would be a very interesting trip.
Yes. Thank you, Esther.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's been one of my biggest disappointments, I think, that we've never gone back, the four of us together, because my parents had a business. It was always either my father and my mother would go, or my mother and my sister and I, or my father and I. It was never the four of us. We came pretty close in 2014 when Leanna and I went to a short story conference in Vienna, and somehow then we ended up being 9 people at this short story conference, and Esther came with her daughters Nicole and Lauren, and I was there with my 3 kids. Everybody came except for Dominic, and my parents were there as well. And another story came out of that trip, and it's called Goethe's Lap. That's in the Pink House, and other stories. Other questions, Liana?
We have a question from Maria Giuseppina, who asks, it seems to me that there are 3 Italys in your story, a place of longing, a place of grief, and a place of reconnection. Do you feel that they have all merged by now?
Uh, I think so. I think so. I mean, the Italy of grief. I mean, I was emotional reading this piece. Might take me about 10 times before I, don't have to wipe my eyes. But I think I'm good. I'm strong. And somebody told me recently that the older you get, the less you care about stuff. I don't know if that's true, but I certainly cry less, so maybe there's part of that is true. But yes, I think they have all merged, and maybe sometimes even subconsciously everything comes together in something that I'm writing.
Anthony Portuguese says, Brava Licia, excuse me, beautiful and heartfelt. I was wondering if you feel your relation to Canada felt different than your peers as a child, as your grandparents still lived back in Italy.
Yes, I did. I I growing up, I mean, until I started going to CEGEP, um, I was always in Montreal North, but I went to elementary school, high school. My parents' butcher shop and then business was in Montreal North. So that was pretty much it until I turned, 17, 18. Then I started leaving that sort of Montreal North circle. But I knew that my friends all had, they had their grandparents. They always had news. our news was from far away, and it got better as we got older because they all got a phone. But I still remember when my parents needed to call or somebody called us. It was sort of, there was that sort of a delay where we would call the bar in the piazza, and then they would go get somebody from the household, and uh, and then we would have to call back like in half an hour. They didn't call us, obviously. We had to call back in half an hour after the person went to get. Not everybody had phones, but yeah.
Carolyn Di Giovanni says, Brava Licia, your memories are heartfelt. Can you describe the first impression you had on discovering the Italian Canadian writers you then pursued in your thesis?
The first impression I had, well, the first book I read by an Italian Canadian writer, but I didn't know she was an Italian Canadian writer, was Darlene Madot's Songs of Silence. Songs of Silence, or Songs and Silence. So I actually, the first time I read an Italian Canadian writer, I didn't, I did quite a bit of research to figure out, like, Madot, is that Italian? Is that not Italian? Then I thought, oh, Madot must be Northern Italian. Then it turned out she wasn't Northern Italian. But reading, I spent a lot of time with Frank Patchy's novels, and actually he gets more attention in the thesis because he had more novels. Um, it was interesting. Of course, it was, my reading was with the purpose of writing a thesis. I think that's a less warm experience than reading a novel like now. I mean, unless you're gonna, write a paper about the novel, but just for fun, I think I'm able to do that now. Read books for fun, as opposed to read books because I have to write an essay or because I have to write a review.
Carmelo Militano asks, is it complicated to decide if you will write using I in contrast to she? And do you fuss or worry about censoring yourself because your writing is too personal?
Yeah, I think yes. So I have my readers, right? My critics, my go-to group, and often uh, they ask me, can you write this same story in the third person, or can you write this same story in the first person? So I actually try it out to see which one works out best. It comes out naturally. I decide to use the first person. Of course, if I'm using the first person and it is a fictional story, people think it's my story, like um, Refuge in the Vineyard. A lot of people think that it's based on facts. The fact is that the main character is disappointed about an early relationship. That's a fact that stems from something that I experienced. But that story is about somebody going back to Italy to visit her father, who's a very, very bitter man because his wife died when they decided to move back to Italy after having spent 50 years in Canada. And that's not true. So really the story is about the vines and the vineyard. And yeah, when I'm writing a story and it's based on something that I feel very much connected to, and especially if it's about pain, I think about it a lot. I'm working on a story now that I've promised to an anthology, that is something that I worked on when I was pregnant with Decho. So it would have been 20 years ago, and I never got to read it or publish it. And I think I just had the courage to write it during that period because I was supposed to read it at a conference, and then I was pregnant and wasn't well enough to travel to this conference, and I never got to read it. And just recently picked it up again. So I might share that. That's a very hard one. I wrote it because I felt I needed to write it. Am I going to change the narrator? I'm not sure. I'm still thinking about it, but I think I'm ready now. Like 20 years later, I'm more detached. Liana?
That's it for the questions.
Questions,
in
that's
the chat.
wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. I have a few people to thank. You can all go to the transformation site if you want to see the photos. I know that there are other comments in the chat that I will read once I get the recording of the chat. So I just want to thank all of you. I also want to mention that on April 13th at 7 p.m., Liana Kuzmano, our host, and Christy Ratto will be hosting the first event that is connected to the anthology that I mentioned, Here and Now, an anthology of queer Italian Canadian writing. That's at 7 p.m. That's on Zoom. If you're interested, you can write to me, or you can find the event. There's actually an event with the link on Zoom, on Facebook. And then next Sunday, same place, same time, Liana will be doing a solo reading titled Poetry and Politics 2. Those of you who came to Liana's Poetry and Politics event last fall, I guess this is the continuation. So you're invited to that. If you're interested, you can send me an email, or you can find the event on Facebook. Thank you all for joining us today. This free event on Zoom was brought to you by the Canada Council for the Arts and the Writers Union of Canada. I'm grateful for their funding. It's part of the Books and Biscotti literary series. And thanks to the Association of Italian Canadian Writers for letting us use their Zoom account. And thanks to Accenti Magazine and Longbridge Books. Thanks to all of you. I really am very grateful that you came to listen to this narrative. And thank you, and have a beautiful, lovely Sunday. So this is it. And now, you can turn on your cameras.